Here's something genuinely interesting. Some of the most truly gifted people you'll ever encounter have absolutely no idea that they are. Not because they're being modest, not because they're concealing something, but because the very traits that make them exceptional also make them feel at times like something is fundamentally wrong with them. That's the quiet paradox sitting at the heart of giftedness. And today, we're going to unpack it not in the way you might expect, not through IQ scores or academic achievements, but through the subtle psychological patterns that appear in everyday life. Patterns that researchers have been carefully studying for decades. Patterns that often go completely unnoticed, even by the very people who carry them. So if you've ever felt like your mind works a little differently, like you feel things more deeply than those around you seem to, like you're always searching for something just slightly beyond your reach, stay with this, because what you're about to hear might explain a great deal about yourself. The first sign is something psychologists call overexcitability. And no, that doesn't mean you're hyperactive or simply anxious. What it actually means is that your nervous system processes the world with far greater intensity than average. The concept was originally developed by Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski, who observed that gifted individuals tend to experience sensory, emotional, and intellectual stimulation much more deeply than the people around them. For you, a piece of music doesn't just sound beautiful, it moves through you completely. An idea doesn't just interest you, it consumes your thoughts for days on end. A conversation doesn't just pass the time, it lingers in your mind long after it's over. This isn't sensitivity in the fragile sense, it's sensitivity in the deeply and vibrantly alive sense. And for many gifted people, this intensity has felt like a burden their entire lives, when in reality it's actually a signal. The second sign is that you ask why constantly, and you always have. As a child, you probably drove adults slightly crazy with your endless questions. Not because you were being deliberately difficult, but because you genuinely needed to understand the reason behind things, not just the rule itself. And that hasn't changed with time. You find it almost impossible to accept information purely at surface level. You need to understand the underlying mechanism, the deeper pattern, the real and complete explanation. Cognitive researchers refer to this as a strong need for cognitive closure. But more precisely, gifted individuals often demonstrate the opposite of that. They're deeply comfortable sitting with open questions, complex and layered ideas, and unresolved thinking. While others want the quick and tidy answer, you want the full picture. That persistent drive is one of the clearest markers of an unusually active and searching mind. Third, you've always felt slightly out of sync with the people around you. Not in an arrogant way, but in a quietly and persistently lonely way. This is one of the most commonly reported experiences among gifted adults, and it's also one of the least openly discussed. Researchers at the Gifted Development Center have found that gifted individuals frequently report feeling like they don't quite belong anywhere, that conversations rarely go deep enough, that humor gets misread, that personal interests simply don't align with those around them. This isn't about being better than others in any way. It's about operating on a slightly different frequency altogether. And when you spend years trying to tune yourself down to match the people surrounding you, it creates a kind of low-grade exhaustion that is very difficult to name or explain. Here's something genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. These first three signs, the intensity, the relentless questioning, the feeling of being perpetually out of sync, they don't usually look like gifts from the outside. They frequently look like problems instead. And that's precisely why so many gifted people move through their entire lives without ever recognizing what they truly carry within them. The fourth sign is a fierce and almost uncomfortable awareness of your own imperfections. Psychologists call this perfectionism, but not in the casual and lighthearted way that word is typically used. This is something considerably deeper. This is a gap, a genuinely painful one, between the extraordinarily high standard your mind sets for itself and what you actually manage to produce. And that gap creates a very specific and relentless kind of self-criticism. Gifted individuals often hold themselves to internal benchmarks that nobody else can see or even comprehend, which means that even when others are genuinely impressed by your work, you already know precisely where it fell short of what it could have been. Studies in giftedness research consistently link this internal perfectionism to high metacognitive ability, meaning your brain is unusually skilled at evaluating its own thinking processes. That capacity is rare and remarkable, but it also means you are your own harshest critic, almost entirely by design. Fifth, you learned early in life how to conceal how smart you actually were. This one is subtle, but it's absolutely real. Many gifted individuals, especially those who grew up in environments where standing out felt genuinely unsafe, develop what researchers call intellectual camouflage. You learn to slow yourself down in conversations, to let others speak before you, to hold back the question you already knew the answer to before it was even fully asked. You learn that being too much, too curious, too intense, too quick made the people around you visibly uncomfortable, so you carefully adjusted yourself, and over time, that adjustment became second nature to you. The real tragedy is that this behavior often becomes so deeply habitual that gifted adults genuinely lose sight of what they're truly capable of. The camouflage eventually becomes the identity. The sixth sign is that your mind makes connections that other people simply don't see, and sometimes you don't even quite know how to explain how you arrived there. This is sometimes described as divergent thinking, the ability to draw meaningful links between ideas, systems, or experiences that appear completely unrelated on the surface. A gifted mind doesn't just think in straight lines. It moves in webs, in networks, in sudden intuitive leaps that feel natural but are actually the result of rapid and largely unconscious synthesis. Neuroscience researchers have discovered that gifted individuals often show significantly greater neural connectivity between regions of the brain that don't typically communicate with each other, which means your brain is quite literally wired to find patterns that others routinely miss. The seventh sign is something that genuinely surprises people, an almost overwhelming and visceral sense of justice. Gifted individuals tend to develop a strong moral sensitivity very early in life. This isn't about following established rules. It's about a deep and instinctive reaction to unfairness, a feeling that something is genuinely and fundamentally wrong when people are treated unjustly. This can make navigating daily life emotionally exhausting because the world, as you've clearly noticed, is filled with small and constant injustices that most people simply move past without a second thought, and you find it profoundly difficult to do the same. Eighth, you have a complicated and uncomfortable relationship with boredom. It's not simply that you get bored easily. It's that boredom for you feels almost physically unbearable. Researchers link this directly to what's known as a high need for stimulation, a lower threshold for understimulation in individuals with highly active prefrontal cortex functioning. In plain and straightforward terms, your brain genuinely requires more input to remain properly engaged. When it doesn't receive that input, it doesn't just idle quietly, it immediately begins generating its own stimulation through worry, through elaborate fantasy, through persistent restlessness. What looks like distraction from the outside is very often your mind searching urgently and desperately for something genuinely worthy of its full attention. The ninth sign is that you feel emotions with unusual and sometimes overwhelming depth, and you've frequently been told throughout your life that you're simply too sensitive. The emotional world of a gifted person is not quieter than average. It is significantly and consistently louder. Research by psychologist Elaine Aron on high sensitivity overlaps considerably with giftedness research in revealing ways. What emerges is a clear picture of someone who processes emotional experience more thoroughly, more slowly, and far more deeply than most others tend to. This isn't weakness in any meaningful sense. This is a genuine neurological reality. The amygdala, the brain's primary emotional processing center, appears to function with considerably greater reactivity in highly intelligent individuals. You don't feel more deeply because you're fragile. You feel more deeply because your brain is quite simply built that way. And the 10th sign, perhaps the most telling and revealing of all, is that you've never quite been able to fully believe the compliments people offer you. This is called imposter phenomenon, and while it touches many people across different walks of life, it tends to run especially and persistently deep in gifted individuals. Because here's the real paradox at work. The higher your internal standard genuinely is, the more deeply convinced you become that you haven't actually met it, even when all available evidence clearly says otherwise. Your awareness of how vast the territory of what you don't yet know truly is, and because your mind is always reaching further ahead, it never quite settles comfortably into any feeling of genuine arrival. So here's the quiet insight that holds all of this together. Giftedness, in the truly psychological sense, is not about exceptional achievement or external recognition. It's not about test scores or trophies displayed on a shelf. It is, at its deepest core, about a fundamentally different way of processing and experiencing the world, more intensely, more thoroughly, more relentlessly than others around you. And because that difference often doesn't feel like an advantage from the inside, because it arrives with its own distinctive and significant weight, many gifted people spend entire decades wondering why they feel so profoundly different without ever fully understanding the real reason why. If several of these signs resonated with you, not as a flattering checklist to feel good about, but as a genuine and quiet recognition of something you've privately lived for a very long time, then perhaps the most useful thing you can take from this is simply permission. Permission to stop seeing your intensity as a personal flaw. Permission to stop apologizing for how deeply you think, or how strongly you feel, or how genuinely impossible it is for you to remain on the comfortable surface of things. Because those aren't problems waiting to be fixed or overcome. They're the natural shape of a particular and remarkable kind of mind. And understanding that shape, truly and honestly understanding it, is where something genuinely important can finally begin.